My name's Aaron Stalker. I'm the range beef cow extension specialist. I'm at the West Central Research and Extension Center in North Platte. I was asked to just take a few minutes and give you an overview of the project that we've started at Brule. I think what my goal is more to kind of give an overview and not so much give a detailed uh, results of our project, but just to kind of let you know what things we're working on, and then hopefully we can kind of act as a prime to get some discussion going after we have some discussion about what things are currently going. We can talk about what the needs are and how we can expand. It was in the fall of 2007 we started this project at Brule. I picture says 1,000 words, and so I thought that that would be the most helpful things to just show you how we've got our treatments. We have 4 different treatments. We have a control or check where we don't remove any residue at all. We have 2 grazing treatments, a light and heavy grazing treatment. Uh, the light grazing treatment, we stock at 1 AUM per acre. The heavy grazing is at 2 AUMs per acre. So the numbers that appear in those treatments, that's how many cattle we had. That kept the length of the grazing period the same across all treatments. In other words, we turn the cows in and take them off on all paddocks at the same time. And the way we get the difference in stocking rates, twice as many cattle in the heavy grazing treatment. And then we have a baling treatment. And the way we do that is we just use a rake to rake the stalks up and then bale them off. I want to mention that this is a multidisciplinary project. We've had a team that's been looking at as many aspects of this as what we can. We're trying to be comprehensive. Uh, my role is to work on the animal performance side of it. We have Simon Van Donk. He wasn't here today, but he's been working on the water aspect. And I think that's especially for our part of the state, that's a really important issue. Water that's lost from the soil as a result of removing the residue. Uh, we've been working to look at plant diseases and also weeds. And then another major area is the soil quality aspects, and Tim's going to talk about those. But so rather than just go into the nitty gritty on all the details of how the cattle are performing and what our soil uh, moisture levels are, I think to me the thing that sums it all up is the subsequent yield, and that's what I just wanted to share with you. These are the yields following for the year following our residue removal treatments. I'm not sure if I mentioned it's continuous, but we have not seen any difference in yield for now 4 years. We're just getting finished picking it for 2013. We don't have the data for that yet, but we don't see any difference in yield across any of our treatments. And I think that's the bottom line, basically, right? That accounts for all of the things that go into the consequences of removing the residue. I think what I'll do now is turn it over to Tim, and Tim can go through got some soil measurements to talk about.
Thank you, Aaron. So I'm Tim Shaver. I'm the soil scientist out at North Platte, and we wanted to start looking at some of the nebulous soil quality parameters that we kind of talked about a little bit, and how grazing and baling of residue might affect some of these things. In particular, one of the questions we get a lot is how it affects compaction. So we have a penetrometer, which basically is just a rod with a load center on it. And it just measures the amount of resistance. It measures it down to about a foot. I've only got results today that just show how it affects the top inch of the soil or first. And what we're really concerned about is water infiltration, if the compaction is water infiltration. So we've taken measurements every spring for the last 3 years to see if there's any compaction across these different treatments. So this is what we found the first year, and we did see significant differences across the different grazing and baling treatments, with the heavy and bale treatments having the highest amount of compaction, and check in the light having similar amounts of compaction. So that's what we saw after the first year. The second year we saw the exact same trends, but we had a lot more variability in the data. So we didn't have any significant differences. You can see the same trends. Yes? Okay, is that better? It's too good, right? And here's what we saw the third year. And in this year, the data kind of bounces around a little bit. So what we're seeing is that we're not getting consistent results from year to year. So trying to is that better? Okay. So we haven't seen consistent results year to year, and we're also not seeing a cumulative effect. So compaction is not increasing year to year. We're seeing in some cases where compaction is higher one year, lower the next. So we're not really seeing a cumulative effect. And one of the big differences that we've seen from that first year, where we kind of saw what we would hypothesize is happening, is that was a really wet winter. And in this data right here, it was a really dry winter. We think that's really going to have an effect on whether or not there's compaction. So another thing I'd like to mention is, as Aaron showed, we're not seeing differences in yields yet. So while we are seeing significant differences in compaction across the grazing and baling treatments, so far at Brule, it is not affecting yield. And the next thing we need to do, which we're going to do this spring, is we're going to start to do infiltration measurements to see if there's a correlation between the compaction differences that we're seeing and the infiltration differences that we're seeing. Now, one thing I should mention, I would believe that this is going to be a very site-specific situation, right? Different soils, different precipitation amounts, different management practices are all going to affect how the cows or the baling affects compaction. So while we're seeing these results at Brule, it's entirely possible that we'd see different results. So this is just one of the things we're doing. We're also doing a lot of soil physical property measurements. Umberto Blanco on campus is involved with this project. We're doing a lot of nutrient cycling effects and a lot of other soil sampling. No, these are all georeferenced points. So we're going to the exact same location every year based on the GPS. And I have never seen the tire tracks out there after the bale. So we're not really having a big issue with tire, actually being able to see tire tracks. We are trying to avoid hoof prints if we can, but we really haven't seen a lot of those. But everything is georeferenced. We're going back to the exact same location. We do it off the UNL soil-based analysis. Not as of yet. Any other questions?
Okay, I guess sometimes there's terms I take for granted, huh? So an AUM, that's an abbreviation for animal unit month, and an animal unit is defined as a 1,000 pound. So then I guess month is self-explanatory. Sorry. It works out that it's 780 pounds of air-dried forage that a 1,000 pound animal consumes per month. But we don't so much worry about what the intake is. We more set it off the stocking rate. So we have the equivalent of 1,000 pound animals per acre on the light grazing treatment, and then 2,000 pounds of animal on the heavy grazing treatment. Yeah, Gary. Oh, yeah, right. It's 60 days. That's right. Yeah, 60 days. So that's a good point. Okay, well, so what's the time? So uh, if the ground is frozen while the cattle are on the field versus what in the spring, I think we could hypothesize that would make a big difference. I think the best way to address that is not from data at Brule, but actually some work that's being done at Mead, and which has been ongoing for a long time. I wish I could remember the first year, but Terry Klopfenstein's worked on it. Gary, didn't you start on it? Oh, that's when the spring grazing treatment started? Okay, but so at Mead, they've got a field where they've grazed a cornfield. It's and one of the treatments is grazing during the winter when the ground's frozen, and then the second one is they've got areas of that field that are grazed only in the spring when it's muddy, and there's no difference in yield on that field. And so those are the two places where we have projects here within the university system where we've looked at the consequences of grazing on subsequent yield, and in both cases we don't see any reduction in yield. So I think that's a this is the sort of thing that I was hoping we could stimulate here, some discussion about these things. To me, I think one of the things that you've hit on is, boy, maybe we need to have some research projects that can address specific things like that, rather than what what. Every time I give this talk, there's always somebody that gives up and he says, "Hey, I know there's an issue because every year when I look at my yield map, I can tell you exactly where the water tank was." And well, that's totally fair and legitimate. If there's a where the cattle spend so much time right there by the at the water tank that could potentially have an issue, or they make trails, right, and potentially on the place where there's trails that could uh, that potentially cause a compaction issue. But I think the thing is to keep that into perspective, like what percentage of the area of a field that is. It's really a minor. Good. Ask anybody that has dryland corners on their pivot where the cattle spend their time first. Right? They really graze those dryland corners a lot more heavily than they do the irrigated portions of the field. So I think, and maybe this isn't the right place to. Uh, we should turn it over to Carla, I guess, and have some more discussion. But these kinds of issues have stimulated us to think, well, we need to expand the scope of the work that we're doing. This project at Brule is a good start, and I think it's addressing some important issues, but there's other issues as well that we need to look at, and that's prompted us. We're actually expanding the work that we're doing. We just started a new site at Gothenburg which we're applying treatments. We're going to be doing additional work at Scotts Bluff, and maybe Carla, you can mention that when you talk about the SARE project. The SARE project is going where we're collaborating with producers, and I think what we need is to have some more discussion about what things do we need, what areas do we need to expand into, and increase the knowledge that we have about the potential impacts, and make sure that we're measuring all those. So maybe Carla, why don't I turn it over to you? Is that Aaron? Is that next? Turn it to Carla, and maybe we can have some more discussion after Carla.
Because of some of these discussions that we've had on the fact that we don't have enough data to really make assessments clear across the state on the use of some of these residues and what the impacts of that really are, we turned in a SARE grant that Rick Rasby led, and we wanted to look at baling, not grazing, or grazing corn stalks across the state and look at subsequent yield and some of these soil parameters that we've been discussing. So this project got funded and it's underway. There are a couple of sites that are set up, but some of us still have corn in the field, so we're not quite set up. But we have sites. There are 5 cooperator sites, and then we have the one site at ARDC that has undergone this ongoing research on the residues. And so there's cooperator sites all across the state, different rainfall areas, different yield differences. And we've got one at Scotts Bluff, one in Rock County. Brent, where's yours? Okay. And then the ARDC, and there should be one more. Nebraska City, yeah, one down in the south corner. Okay, so pretty wide variation of where they're set up. And so the design is that it would be replicated at each location. So it's divided up where there's 2 replications of grazing on the field, and like a hot fence in the middle and a tank at one end. And then there'll be areas on each side of the replication where we fence it out. Cattle aren't allowed there, and then we'll either not take anything off or we'll bale part of that. The stocking rates will be based on the yield, but they'll be the same on that basis. So some places may have more yield of corn, so therefore they end up with more husks and leaves. So we'll target taking off about 20% or about half of the husk and leaf that's there, but how it's stocked will be dependent on how much was there to begin with. So we'll do soil measurements before and after, and then we'll measure yield of the subsequent crop. It's a 3-year project, and then we'll have demonstrations and field days at the locations where it was set up. Am I forgetting anything, Brent? Okay. Yes. Well, they're not going to be more confined on one site. I mean, it's not like the same number of cattle for that. It's half and half. Right. And we'll take the yield out in the middle. We won't take yields along the fences where they might have walked along right up next to the tank. Aaron, what were you going to say? Oh, yes. At the end, in the 3rd year, is when we'll have the the demonstrations.
So Denny, did you want to talk any about the white paper and what's happened with that with the beef group? Or? Way to pass the buck there, Denny. All right. Yeah. No, so I was just going to give a brief update. This kind of ties into the Rural Institute and looking at how do we develop enterprises for rural areas. Again, one of the thoughts is how do we take advantage of the possibility of more fully integrating the use of crop residues into systems. And so we've talked about, and there's a cluster hire right now in the process of looking at more fully developing some of these opportunities. This would be one in animal science, one in agronomy, and one in ag econ, where we further look at opportunities like cover crops and also crop residues and how those can fit in a system. So we have a working white paper as part of the beef group right now, where we're using that as a basis to kind of give us some focus and encourage the consideration of opportunities to develop some programming and also some applied research, as well as university research, to get some questions answered and hopefully have some information we can use to serve the clients. So anything to add to that, Denny? It's on the SharePoint. Yep. Yep. Dr. Randall, do you want to add anything? Okay. So I'm going to jump in here since I've been kind of coordinating conference calls. We've had some crops and water and beef calls. I think we've had 3 of them since August talking about some of the issues with crop residue. I'm just going to bring up some of the things we've talked about and maybe generate a little discussion here. So one of the questions obviously that's come up is there's real differences across the state in terms of soil type, precipitation, dry land versus irrigated, subsequent cropping system. Is it no-till? Is it conventional type tillage? Also looking at the situation, especially in the Republican River area and also further west where we have limited precipitation, looking at pumping restrictions. How does a possibility of grazing and some residue removal affect subsequent evaporation and impact the subsequent yields? So those are all questions that have come up. I think some of the questions already brought up around, management of grazing on those acres is an issue we need to get a better handle on. I don't think we know there's some behavior changes if we have cattle grazing dry land stocks that are right next to irrigated. We know just from observation that when plants are stressed, animals tend to prefer those. We can just see that from just observation. So I think those are some questions we have around management and what we can do. I guess I'd open it up to the group for some discussion and some questions as far as thinking about livestock, especially cattle, and use of, here we're thinking about specifically corn stock residue. Again, I think one of the things I run into as I work with producers is some of the questions that already been brought up. Is management obviously makes a difference. And so timing of use, how long the cattle are there, soil type, where the tank was placed in the field. There's a lot of different things that go into what could impact subsequent crop production. And I don't know how we address all of those, but I think we try to address the macro issues as best we can to have some information that we can provide.
one of the things we're seeing in the irrigated seed corn area is a lot of cover crops going into those acres and a lot of cattle grazing those acres. And so, you know, I don't know if we go out and visit with some of those producers to see what's going on, because if I'm a seed corn producer, you know, I'm really worried about the subsequent yields, but we're seeing this occur in more and more of our acres. So, you know, there must not be a whole lot of yield being hurt in those situations. And so I think there's a lot of potential interest. We've seen more livestock in our area the last couple years than we've had for a long time. So, you know, I think this is an area where we got to keep looking at, and, you know, I probably have a lot of questions, don't know the answers, but we need to work in that area. Jenny?
This spring, I had several crop producers approach me asking about cover crops. And the mentality of our crop producers, or these in particular, larger crop producers don't want anything to do with having to manage livestock. And so with the storm that hit Clay County and devastated so many acres of the county, it provided an opportunity. All of a sudden, we had an opportunity to put in cover crops, and people started thinking about it differently. We had crop producers who were seeking out young people or people who were willing to lease livestock and put up the fence, maintain the water, stay there with the cattle, watch the fields for them, so that the crop producer didn't have to do anything with it. And to me, this is an opportunity. This is something I would be willing to work on with a group of people, because to me, this is a viable option for bringing someone back or giving someone an opportunity, creating entrepreneurship out there. So this is something I watched this year. I'm willing to work with anyone who wants to address that as a potential.
I think following Danny and Janny, one thing that we do is we are able to carry about twice the cows we can on our ranch because we send corn stalks. And so they go from Thedford to Wallace, which is about a 2.5 hour truck drive. But Tom takes care of those cattle, and he doesn't own the cropland, he doesn't own the cattle, but he gets paid very well over the winter for putting up the fence, working with those farmers to secure that crops, and he does all the water and the fencing and does a really good job. And you know, we pay him well to do that, but it's worth it. But Tom's getting up there in age, and I don't know who's going to take over for him. So I think there's enterprises, even if you don't want to own cattle, that opportunity's still there.
Well, a lot of you guys don't know my history, but back in between 92 and 97, I worked at the ARDC in this integrated farm project, and we did a lot of this grazing, and I haven't said much before that just because it's been 15 years ago, and there's been a lot of changes in hybrids and all this stuff. And also Mark Schroeder, who's a director up there now, did a couple-year project on a couple pivots where he looked at grazing, had cattle on half the pivot, you know, through the winter time, and then he took them off and found no difference in yields. And I had several trials with this as far as that when I was working on this project, this integrated farm project. And all this data is pretty much on all the beef reports back in the mid-90s to 2000 or so. It's all published in beef reports, but at that time there was a lot of newspaper articles showing out as far as, you know, the effect of grazing. And actually what I did, sometimes I did some infiltration rates, and I actually did in the hoof prints and then the non-hoof prints, and then I did like a transect and then measured, you know, how much of it was tracking was done. And yeah, definitely in that hoof print, it was, you know, in that early well, in the first 3 inches, there was a tremendous amount of compaction in there, and then when you get a big rain, it really run off that way. But you know, in general, the whole field wasn't done. So, but there needs to be more research done in this. But then the other thing about the cover crops in the Dakotas, they're kind of the pioneers. Have been doing a lot of this, and you know, grazing it, and that's kind of the thing that they're saying. Well, a lot of it's anecdotal or whatever, but we need to do more research on this. But they're, you know, they're saying, well, using those cover crops is improving the soil, and with the cattle, it's making it the soil health. It's improving it, and you know, a lot of these farmers have been doing it for several years, and it seems to be working. But you know, we need to do research on that. But and rather than hurting it, it seems to be helping the soil. They're thinking whether that's true or not, but that's something I think we need to look at. And I think this new grant is going to help with some of that as well. The way I understand some of the projects they got going with that, they're going to do some of those measurements. So something that'd be good to do across the state as well.
So one thing I've been doing recently, again, is coordinating kind of a crops, water, beef call where we could have some discussion around this. I think those have been productive. We've had some good discussion. We've had some good questions come up. My thought would be after today, we'd go ahead and continue to do those and look at where there's some opportunities to work collaboratively for those of you who would like to, whether it be a SARE grant where we might pursue or some other grant opportunity. It appears right now there's a fertile time to do some research in this area because of the interest that's there. I'm thinking specifically of cover crops. But I think we need to take advantage of this. I know out where I'm at, producers I work with are asking for this kind of information, and we frankly don't have very much from a research data standpoint to present to them. And I agree with what Gary said. There's a lot of anecdotal data coming out, and it's coming from areas that are different climatically, soil type than is here. And it's a little concerning for me when people come and are talking about their place and say this will work here. And if we have data, then we can give people solid research-based information for them to make decision, and not just have anecdotal information. Not that anecdotal information isn't important, because I think it sometimes spurs us to do things we need to do. But I think it's an area we candidly are weak in, and if we can find a way to get some research data to begin to help people have information to make decisions, that's really our role. So, other questions or comments?
I'm just going to make one possibility. I know Keith in our on-farm research group is interested and would work at, if you as a beef group could come up with some ways that you might be able to put together on-farm research studies where you might say fence, you know, a couple sections of a quarter, and then keep, you know, in 2 sections have the livestock, 2 sections you don't, and then try and get yield data. I think there would be great interest in trying to do that on a few of these farms. In a lot of cases, you know, it may not work, but if we could find a few, then we'd have some good data that might be useful. So contact any of us, you know, and come up with a protocol.
Well, we do got these, they call them SARE mini grants, which I'm kind of administer here in the state. And the one thing is we want to try to, well, they're pretty much, you want to educate other educators or train-to-trainer type things. But we have a few of these going on. I know Jenny Nixon's doing something up there looking at using hay as a, trying to serve as kind of as a tank heater type thing, and she's trying to do that with a couple of producers out there. But that's something they can educate to educators, but maybe we would have up to $2,500 to $5,000 that could be used across the state for some of these project on maybe with the cover crops or the grazing or a combination of something like that. So we have it on our website, and actually they're submitted, and then if you submit it, and then there's a 3 or 4 advisory committee where they review them and that type of thing. But usually if they're have good content, they're going to get funded. So that's some way you may get a little bit of seed money to at least start on that. And then there's also the professional development things as well. So.
So fortunately, Jerry Valesky had the data from that project we were talking about at Mead, where we've had the 3 different treatments of control, winter grazing, and spring grazing. So we'll get those up for you. One comment I guess that I would just make, I think that a lot of the questions that we have are valid, and there's a lot of issues that we need to continue to research and look at in more detail. But the key points, I think, from our project at Brule, which is relatively short term, and then this long-term project at the ARDC, is that we're not seeing any differences in subsequent yield. And I realize that's not the complete picture, right? There's more things to consider than just subsequent yield, but the key to me, that's a key measure. And all of our controlled, replicated research experiments show that there's no depression in yield. Is that this next slide, Jerry, that's got the... Oh, okay, so this is just a diagram. It shows... I can't remember exactly what day the fall grazing starts. I think it's just as soon as they can get on in the fall. So basically, November, and then they move the cows to the spring grazing treatment in March, and they stay there till just as long as they can until it's time to get the tractor in the field. So I don't know exactly the dates, but I think should have. Yeah, then I know they do that, and I don't know the history because it's been more than 20 years of research on that field, and I don't know just exactly what they do to get through storms. I think, Jenny, when we start talking about people who are going to start taking in cattle and that being an enterprise, I think that's just something that they really need to be prepared for. We're fortunate, out west we don't get near as much snow, and it seems like it. Well, obviously it varies from year to year, but we're lucky it can melt off, and cattle can dig through snow. Ice is a completely different story, and the further east you go, the more likely ice storms are, and why you just really need to be prepared to get through those, don't you? So, so that's it is. It's definitely an issue, and well, yeah, I agree. Right. You have to be realistic. And I think those are some of the things that we probably will have to address in some of these continued projects. Yeah, and now I don't know if I mentioned, did I mention that this is a corn soybean rotation? So these are the soybean yields the year immediately following grazing. And it turns out that 2 bushels is statistically significant. So there's actually an increase in yield on the soybeans. And then, so for the next year, where they plant corn again in the rotation, that's great. Yeah, and so we're expanding, right? We're adding locations. The SARE project is a big help for that. We've got additional sites where we're expanding, and yeah, and I agree. I think this cover crop area, especially grazing of cover crops, that's got a lot of potential that we really need to exploit. Okay, is there any? I'll turn back to you, Aaron, but we're sure open to more discussion or questions.
So if we stay on schedule in the interest of time, I think our portion is about up. I think we're going to have a kind of a wrap up. But if you haven't been part of the Adobe Connect conference calls and you'd like to be, send me an email. Again, that's Aaron Berger, and you're welcome to be part of those. I think the goal would be is we have some discussion around where we could maybe have the opportunity to collaborate again and move forward on maybe some demonstration projects, or also work on possibly some collaboration on potential grant opportunities, and just explore further how we might put people in a position again to have information to make